He had always been the kind of kid who seemed invisible, not in the way people are quietly noticed, but in the way that everyone seemed to forget he existed until there was a chance to tease him. At school, he walked through hallways filled with laughter, voices raised in excitement, and he felt like he was watching life happen from behind a glass wall. Kids rushed past him with their latest shoes, phones, and gadgets, laughing about games he didn't play or jokes he didn't understand. He tried to smile, to be part of it, but the truth was that he didn't quite fit in, and everyone around him noticed. His clothes were always a little worn, his backpack patched in several places, and his shoes had soles that were always a little too thin. He didn't have the latest sneakers or a new phone like everyone else. He couldn't keep up with trends, and that made him an easy target. There were whispers behind his back, and sometimes those whispers turned into cruel jokes aimed directly at him. Kids would snicker when he tried to answer questions in class or stumble over his words in a presentation. He could feel their eyes on him, judging, laughing, and he would shrink into himself, wishing he could disappear completely. Despite all of this, he had a spark inside him that nobody could see. While other kids were focused on showing off, he was quietly observing, learning, and imagining something bigger for himself. He would sit alone during lunch sometimes, sketching ideas in a notebook or writing down dreams that seemed far away. He thought about the future a lot, and even though his present was hard, he believed deep down that he could make something of himself if he worked hard enough. But at 12, 13, 14 years old, that idea seemed impossible. At home, things weren't much better. His family struggled financially, and he often felt the weight of responsibility even at a young age. There were nights when the electricity would go out and he would sit in the dark, listening to the distant sounds of the neighborhood and wondering why life seemed so hard for him when it came so easy for others. But he never let himself complain. He would remind himself that the only person who could change his life was him. School days were the hardest. He remembers one particular moment that seemed to define everything for him. It was during gym class, and he had been picked last for teams as usual. The coach barely glanced at him, and the other kids exchanged quiet smirks. They made jokes about how slow he was, how clumsy he looked running across the field. He stumbled once, and the laughter that erupted was so loud that he could feel it echoing in his chest for days. He wanted to fight back with words, but nothing ever came out right. All he could do was lower his head and keep moving. There was also the time in science class when he tried to answer a question the teacher asked. He had read ahead in the textbook and he knew the answer, but when he spoke, his voice wavered and some kids whispered, "Why even try?" That moment stuck with him. He wanted to scream, to tell them they were wrong, but he couldn't. Instead, he walked out of class feeling small, like he had no place in that world of laughter and confidence. Even in moments of brief happiness, there was always that shadow of ridicule following him. Birthday parties, sports events, school trips. He was either forgotten or made fun of. Once, during a school talent show, he had practiced for weeks to play a song on the piano. When he stepped onto the stage, the lights bright and his hands shaking, he played as best as he could. But when he finished, a few students laughed, calling it boring and sad. The applause from a handful of kind kids barely made up for the humiliation, and he left the stage with tears in his eyes. Despite all of this, he never gave up completely. In the quiet moments, he would imagine a different life for himself. He imagined a life where he was respected, where people listened to him and valued his opinions. He imagined walking down the street and people noticing him, not to laugh or judge, but because he had accomplished something significant. These thoughts kept him going, even on the days when the ridicule felt too heavy to bear. He had a few friends, but even they didn't fully understand him. They liked him, sure, but he always felt a little out of place. Conversations often drifted toward things he didn't care about or couldn't afford. He would laugh along, trying to fit in, but inside, he felt a quiet distance between himself and everyone else. It was like watching life from behind a curtain, being part of the world but never fully in it. There were moments when he wondered if anyone could ever see him for who he truly was. He wasn't smart in the way the top students were. He wasn't athletic and he wasn't fashionable. But he had ideas, imagination, and determination. He spent hours reading books about people who had started with nothing and ended up changing the world in their own way. Those stories gave him hope. He would imagine himself years from now, in a life where no one could mock him, where he could walk into a room and be noticed for his achievements rather than his appearance or mistakes. Even though he felt invisible most of the time, He paid attention. He noticed how people spoke, how they moved, and how they treated each other. He learned from the failures around him. He watched as the popular kids sometimes made bad decisions, and he remembered those lessons. Slowly, he began to realize that life wasn't just about being liked or accepted. It was about learning, growing, and preparing for opportunities that others might miss. He also discovered small ways to build confidence. He started practicing speaking in front of the mirror, working on his posture, and setting small goals for himself every day. If he could master one thing, even if it was minor, he would feel a little stronger, a little more ready to face the world. Over time, these small victories gave him a sense of control over his life. He wasn't helpless, even if it felt that way sometimes. One thing that kept him going was imagining a future where he could return to that school, not to get revenge, but to show that he had succeeded despite everything. He imagined walking down the same hallways, seeing the same faces that once laughed at him, and knowing that he had overcome his struggles. It wasn't about them anymore. It was about proving to himself that he could rise above, that he could become someone they couldn't ignore. He spent nights dreaming and planning, thinking about what skills he could learn, what steps he could take to create a different life. While other kids were wasting time on social media or gossip, he read books, learned new skills online, and started to think about businesses or careers that could help him rise above his circumstances. Every small action, every effort was a step toward the future he imagined. Despite the teasing, the isolation, and the moments of deep loneliness, he never let bitterness take over. He knew that anger wouldn't get him anywhere. Instead, he focused on building something that no one could take away from him: knowledge, skill, and determination. He started to feel a quiet power growing inside him, one that didn't need to be loud or flashy. It was the power to change his life, the power to rise above the mocking and the laughter. Even at 14, he had moments of clarity where he realized that the people who teased him weren't cruel because of him. They were insecure themselves. He noticed how easily they could be swayed by popularity and trends, and he understood that their judgments didn't define him. This realization gave him strength. He started to think less about fitting in and more about becoming someone who could stand on his own, no matter what others thought. By the time he finished high school, he had endured years of mockery, awkward moments, and self-doubt, but he had also built resilience, learned lessons, and developed a quiet determination that no one could see yet. He had learned to plan, to save, to work hard, and to stay focused on his goals, even when the world around him was chaotic and dismissive. Looking back, those years of struggle weren't just painful, they were shaping him. Every insult, every fall, every moment of loneliness was teaching him something important about life and about himself. He was learning patience, resilience, and the value of working quietly, while others wasted time on superficial things. Deep down, he knew that if he kept going, if he stayed focused, he would have a chance to rewrite his story. And so, as he walked home on another cold afternoon, passing groups of kids laughing and joking, he held his head a little higher. He didn't fit in, he wasn't noticed, and he was mocked, but he was also learning, growing, and imagining a future that no one could take away from him. One day, he told himself, he would show them all. Not because he wanted revenge, but because he wanted to prove that even the quiet, overlooked kid could become someone extraordinary. Even though he felt small now, he carried a vision of something bigger. That vision would guide him through the challenges ahead, through the mistakes, and through the moments of doubt. It was the seed of determination that would one day grow into a life no one could ignore, a life that would command respect, and a presence that would make even the cruelest mockers pause and reconsider everything they thought they knew about him. He was invisible now, but he was not powerless. And that quiet, burning determination would carry him forward into the life he had always imagined. A life where the laughter would no longer hurt. A life where he would finally be seen. After high school, he left town quietly. No one really noticed, and that was exactly how he wanted it. He wasn't running away, he was starting fresh. He knew he needed space, away from the mocking faces and the memories that weighed him down. The first few weeks were hard. He didn't have much money, and he took the oddest jobs just to survive. He washed dishes, cleaned offices, and sometimes delivered packages. Each day was exhausting, but he reminded himself that every small effort was a step toward something bigger. At first, it felt like the world was against him. People treated him like another ordinary kid with nothing to offer. Some bosses were impatient, some customers rude, and he often came home at night tired, sore, and frustrated. He wondered if maybe he had been dreaming too big. But then he would think about the years of being mocked, of feeling small, and a small spark of determination would ignite inside him. He refused to give up. If he kept moving, kept learning, he could build a life no one could ignore. He didn't have friends in this new city at first, and he spent a lot of time alone. At night he walked the streets thinking about what he wanted. He went to libraries, read books, and took notes on everything he learned. He read about business, self-improvement, and stories of people who had started with nothing. Those stories inspired him. He realized that the difference between success and failure wasn't luck. It was knowledge, effort, and persistence. Slowly, he started creating a plan for his life. He didn't have much money to invest, so he learned skills that didn't cost a lot. He started learning online, watching videos, reading articles, and practicing every day. He focused on areas that could help him earn a living and grow in the future. Some days were frustrating. He would fail at a task, struggle to understand a new concept, or feel too tired to keep going. But each failure taught him something new. He realized that failure was not the enemy. Quitting was. He also started to take care of himself in ways he never had before. He paid attention to his health, exercising in small ways, running when he could, and eating better when he had access to food. He noticed how much better he felt physically and mentally. Confidence didn't come overnight, but every small improvement made him feel stronger, like he was taking control of his life. In the evenings, he would often look at the city skyline and imagine his future. He pictured himself running a business, driving his own car, living in a comfortable apartment, and having people respect him for his ideas and abilities. It was a vision he clung to during the tough days. He would imagine returning to his hometown one day and seeing the same faces that once laughed at him. He didn't plan to gloat, but he wanted to show them that persistence, focus, and hard work could transform anyone's life. Along the way, he met people who taught him lessons he would never forget. One was a small business owner who took him under his wing for a short time. The man saw his determination and willingness to learn. He didn't care that the boy didn't have experience. He saw his potential. From him, he learned about customer service, organization, and the importance of reputation. Another mentor, a librarian, encouraged him to keep reading and learning even when it felt hard. Each encounter shaped him, giving him tools and ideas he could use in the future. There were moments of doubt, of course. Sometimes he felt exhausted, worn down by the endless struggle. Money was always tight, and he often had to choose between paying rent, buying food, or spending on materials to learn new skills. He slept on hard floors, ate simple meals, and sometimes felt invisible even in the busy city. But in those moments, he reminded himself of the vision he held. He imagined the life he wanted, the respect he would earn, and the freedom that came from being in control of his own destiny. That vision became his anchor. Slowly, he began to see results. The small jobs he worked led to better ones. Skills he learned allowed him to take on side projects, and soon, he was earning a little more money than he ever thought possible. Each paycheck, no matter how small, felt like proof that his efforts were working. It wasn't glamorous and it wasn't easy, but it was progress. He also discovered the power of networking. At first it felt awkward to talk to strangers, but he realized that many opportunities came from conversations, from being willing to ask questions and listen carefully. He met people from all walks of life. Some were supportive, others indifferent, and a few were outright discouraging. He learned to filter out the negativity and hold on to the advice and encouragement that mattered. As months turned into years, his skills grew. He became proficient in areas that once seemed impossible. He learned not just from books and videos, but from real-life experience, making mistakes, correcting them, and improving each day. He realized that life's lessons often came through struggle, and the harder he worked, the more resilient he became. Even as he became more capable, he never forgot the feeling of being mocked and overlooked. Those memories weren't a source of bitterness. Instead, they motivated him. He remembered the faces that laughed, the voices that whispered, and the moments of isolation. He used them as fuel, a reminder that he could create a life where no one would ever underestimate him again. He also learned patience. Success didn't come quickly, and he had to wait for opportunities. He understood that small, consistent efforts were better than sporadic bursts of work. Each day he focused on improvement even if it felt slow. He began to understand that the foundation he was building now would support him later in ways he couldn't imagine. Along the way, he saved money wherever he could. He didn't waste it on things he didn't need. Clothes were basic, meals were simple, and every penny that could be saved or invested went toward building his future. It wasn't easy living this way, but he saw it as a necessary sacrifice. Each small choice he made now was an investment in the life he wanted to create. He also started to build confidence in unexpected ways. Speaking up at work, handling difficult situations with patience, and solving problems that others ignored, all gave him a quiet strength. He realized that confidence wasn't about looking good or having friends. It was about knowing you could handle life's challenges, no matter how small or big. Years passed, and he became someone others started to notice, not in a flashy way, but in a way that mattered. He could solve problems, offer useful advice, and approach challenges with calm determination. People began to trust him, seek his input, and even recommend him for opportunities. He had grown from the shy, mocked boy into a young man who could hold his own, even in the toughest situations. Even as success started to come, he stayed humble. He remembered the lonely nights, the times he was laughed at, and the countless moments when he felt invisible. Those memories kept him grounded and reminded him of where he came from. He also knew that real success wasn't just about money or status. It was about respect, independence, and the ability to make a difference in life on your own terms. He also found joy in simple victories. Completing a project successfully, earning a small promotion, or even being thanked by someone he helped became sources of satisfaction. Each win, no matter how minor, reminded him that he was capable and that the years of struggle had not been wasted. During this time, he also began to imagine the day he would return to his hometown. He pictured himself walking into places where he had once been mocked and feeling proud, not angry. It wasn't about revenge, it was about showing what persistence, focus, and hard work could achieve. That vision kept him motivated even during the hardest days. He realized that life wasn't fair, but it could be changed. The mockery, the ridicule, the feeling of invisibility, none of that defined him. Only his actions, his choices, and his effort could shape the life he wanted. He became a person who believed in himself, even when the world seemed indifferent. By the time he reached his mid-20s, he had become remarkably skilled, confident, and self-reliant. He had saved enough to start small investments, to take risks, and to explore bigger opportunities. The shy, overlooked boy who once felt invisible had transformed into someone capable of achieving extraordinary things. The foundation of his life, built with patience, effort, and determination, was strong and unshakable, and yet he never forgot the lessons of the past. The mocking faces, the whispers, and the moments of loneliness were never far from his mind. They had taught him resilience, humility, and the power of quiet determination. They had shown him what it meant to struggle, to fight for every small victory, and to believe in himself when no one else did. He now understood that the journey itself had been as important as the destination. Every odd job, every night spent studying alone, every moment of doubt had shaped him into a man who could face the world with confidence. And though he had not yet returned to his hometown, he felt ready to show that the boy they laughed at had become a man they could not ignore. The years of struggle, learning, and growth had prepared him. And now, with skills, experience, and quiet confidence, he was on the path to a life that would exceed even his own dreams. He knew challenges would continue to come, but he had learned that no obstacle was too great for someone willing to work, learn, and persist. In those moments, standing alone in a small apartment, looking at the city lights through a narrow window, he felt a sense of calm. The boy who had been mocked, laughed at, and overlooked was no longer powerless. He was becoming the person he had always imagined, a man who could face any challenge, pursue any dream, and one day return home to show the world what was possible when determination and patience meet opportunity. Years had passed since he had quietly left his hometown. The boy who had once walked the school hallways with his head down was gone, replaced by a man who carried himself with quiet confidence. He had learned, grown, and built a life that gave him a sense of control he had never known before. But returning to the town where everyone had once mocked him felt different. It wasn't just a place on the map anymore. It was a place filled with memories, both painful and motivating. Every street, every corner, every old building reminded him of the boy he had been, and the determination he had developed in silence. He arrived on the outskirts of town quietly, observing the familiar streets from the car window. Things looked smaller than he remembered. The school was still there, though it had been renovated and looked more modern. The grocery store where he had once run errands for his mom was still standing, and the old park where kids had teased him during recess had new benches and a fresh coat of paint. Everything seemed familiar and strange at the same time. He felt a strange mix of nostalgia and anticipation, knowing that soon he would face people who had once laughed at him. He checked into a small hotel for the night, choosing to stay nearby but out of the spotlight. He didn't need anyone to know he was back yet. He wanted to observe, to feel the town, and to prepare for what he would do next. Lying in bed, he thought about the years that had passed. He remembered the countless nights spent studying, the jobs he had taken to survive, and the skills he had worked hard to learn. Every challenge he had faced had led him here. The thought of finally returning made him feel alive, a mix of excitement and quiet determination coursing through him. The next morning, he stepped out onto the streets dressed in a way that showed he had achieved success without being flashy. People looked at him as he walked past, some curious, some indifferent, and a few smiled politely, unaware of the history he carried with him. He noticed familiar faces, some older, some younger, some working the same jobs they had years ago. Life had moved on for everyone, but he could see who had grown and who had stayed the same. He decided to visit a local cafe, one he had often walked past as a boy. Sitting there with a cup of coffee, he watched the world go by. People chatted, laughed, and went about their days. He felt a quiet power in simply observing, understanding that this town, which had once seemed so large and overwhelming, was now a place he could navigate with ease. He thought about the people who had mocked him, the moments when he had felt small and invisible, and he felt no anger, only a calm clarity. He had changed, and they had no idea what was coming. Word started to spread quietly about someone back in town who had achieved success. People began to whisper, curious about the man who seemed different from anyone they remembered. Some remembered the shy boy who had walked through their classrooms quietly. Others had forgotten him entirely. But as he moved through familiar places, he could feel a subtle shift in attention. People began to notice his presence in a way they had never done before. It was strange, almost surreal, to realize that he had gone unnoticed for so long, and now his very presence commanded interest. He also reconnected with a few people who had been kind to him in the past, those who had never joined in the teasing. They were surprised to see him, their eyes widening as they recognized the growth and confidence he now carried. Conversations were polite at first, cautious, but soon they noticed his warmth and intelligence. It was a reminder that some people see beyond appearances, and those relationships meant more to him than he could explain. He realized that kindness, even in small doses, had lasting value. As the day went on, he began to plan how he would finally face the larger group, the classmates who had once mocked him relentlessly. He knew he didn't need to shout or brag. He understood that true impact came from presence, confidence, and the quiet display of success. He remembered the countless hours of hard work, the skills he had learned, and the mistakes he had turned into lessons. This was the moment he had imagined for years, not for revenge, but to show that he had grown in ways they could not have anticipated. By late afternoon, he had returned to the area near the school, where many of the familiar faces still gathered. Some recognized him immediately, their expressions flickering between surprise and disbelief. Others took a moment, their memories struggling to match the confident man before them with the shy, overlooked boy they had once mocked. He could feel the change in energy around him, a mix of curiosity and awkwardness. He walked with his head held high, letting the silence speak louder than words ever could. One of the former classmates, a boy who had been especially cruel during school, tried to make a joke as he passed. But he noticed immediately that the man he was addressing was not the boy he remembered. The quiet confidence, the composure, and the subtle strength in his gaze made the mocking feel inappropriate. There was no anger, no rush to defend himself, just a calm assurance that his past no longer had power over him. The former classmate walked away, unsure of what to say, realizing that things had changed. He spent time visiting old friends, chatting with shopkeepers who remembered him, and walking down streets that held memories of awkward encounters and painful moments. Each place reminded him of how far he had come. The small victories, the late nights of studying, the odd jobs, and the moments of doubt had all contributed to this transformation. He felt proud, not just of his achievements but of the resilience and determination that had brought him here. He also noticed subtle changes in himself that were no longer about survival. He had learned patience, humility, and the power of observation. He could read a room, understand people's intentions, and navigate conversations with ease. The boy who had stumbled through social interactions was gone, replaced by a man who understood the value of calm and presence. He realized that real strength was quiet, not loud, and it came from inner confidence rather than outward appearances. As evening approached, he decided to visit a gathering spot where many locals met to socialize. The energy there was lively, filled with laughter, chatter, and the sounds of daily life. When he arrived, the whispers started. People recognized him, and the reactions were a mix of astonishment, curiosity, and disbelief. Some remembered the shy boy, others didn't remember him at all, but the aura he carried, self-assurance, composure, and a subtle confidence was impossible to ignore. He didn't need to speak loudly or boast. His presence alone made a statement. He walked slowly through the crowd, smiling politely, shaking hands with those who approached him and acknowledging the curious glances with calm grace. People were intrigued, some unsure whether to approach him, others simply watching from a distance. It was a silent display of power, a demonstration of how far he had come without saying a single word about the years of struggle. By nightfall, he reflected on the day's events. He had walked through familiar streets, revisited old places, and observed the reactions of people who had once overlooked or mocked him. He felt a mixture of satisfaction and anticipation. The next step was approaching the people who had once been cruel, those who had laughed at his mistakes and whispered behind his back. He knew that confrontation didn't need to be dramatic. It was about showing that he had grown and that their judgments no longer mattered. As he prepared for the next day, he felt calm and collected. The man he had become had earned the right to face his past without anger or resentment. He had worked quietly, built skills, earned respect, and developed the inner strength that no mockery could shake. The town that once seemed so small and overwhelming now felt like a stage for him to demonstrate his transformation. He reminded himself that this wasn't about revenge or humiliation. It was about presence, confidence, and the quiet proof that he had achieved something meaningful. The years of struggle had taught him patience, focus, and the value of persistent effort. He had turned hardship into fuel, mistakes into lessons, and solitude into a period of growth that no one could take away. The night passed with him reflecting on his journey. He remembered the small boy who had walked the hallways with his head down, the lonely nights at home, the moments of doubt, and the whispered insults that had once hurt so much. All of it had shaped him, prepared him, and strengthened him. He realized that those years had been necessary, even if painful, because they had given him the tools to succeed. By morning, he felt ready. He had returned to his hometown not to seek approval, but to demonstrate the quiet power of persistence and self-belief. He knew that some people would struggle to recognize him, some would be impressed, and others might remain indifferent. That didn't matter. What mattered was that he had transformed himself, and now he could move forward with confidence, dignity, and pride. As he walked through the streets once more, he felt a sense of calm satisfaction. The boy who had once been mocked and overlooked was gone. In his place was a man who had built a life through effort, learning, and determination. The town was the same, but he was different. And soon those who had once ridiculed him would see the change, not in loud words, but in the quiet. Strength, presence, and confidence he now carried. He had arrived not just physically, but in life, in character, and in the sense of self-worth he had earned. And as he looked ahead, he knew that the moment of true reckoning, the moment when the past and present would meet, was approaching. He would not need to speak loudly, for his life, his achievements, and the man he had become would say everything for him. The day had finally come. After years of preparation, struggle, and silent growth, he was ready to face the people who had once mocked him. He didn't feel nervous in the way he thought he would. There was no panic, no fear. Instead, there was calm determination and a quiet confidence that radiated from him. He had imagined this moment countless times over the years, walking in their shoes, standing tall, showing them that the boy they had laughed at had changed. He drove slowly toward the familiar gathering spot, the place where people met on weekends, laughed, and shared stories. As he approached, he could already sense the energy shifting. People were chatting, drinking coffee, and joking, completely unaware that someone important to their past was returning in a way they could never have expected. He parked the car a little away from the main area, waiting for the right moment. The car itself, sleek and commanding, reflected the life he had built, a life of success, determination, and focus. It wasn't flashy for attention, but its presence was undeniable. Stepping out of the car, he felt a shift immediately. Eyes turned toward him, some wide in surprise, others narrowing in recognition. There were whispers, quiet at first, then louder as people noticed who it was. Some paused mid-conversation, staring. Others hesitated, unsure whether to approach. And then he walked toward them, calm and measured, with a small smile that spoke more than words ever could. He could see the old faces he remembered so well. The boy who had teased him relentlessly now looked awkward, unsure and off balance. Others who had whispered insults in the past were suddenly silent, their expressions a mix of shock and curiosity. They were realizing that the person standing before them was no longer the boy they had dismissed. His posture, his manner, and the quiet strength in his eyes spoke louder than any words. Some people tried to make jokes, attempting to recreate the same teasing atmosphere they had once enjoyed. But it fell flat. The energy had changed. He was no longer small, invisible, or unsure. He didn't need to raise his voice or argue. His presence alone commanded respect. The laughter that once echoed at his expense was now replaced with a kind of awkward admiration. They realized that their past judgments didn't matter here. The boy they had mocked had grown into a man who could not be overlooked. He approached a group of classmates, the ones who had been cruelest. There was a moment of silence as recognition fully set in. Eyes widened, mouths opened, then closed again. There were no words that could capture the surprise. No quick response to match the quiet power he now carried. He didn't speak immediately. He simply smiled, shaking a few hands, acknowledging them politely. The calm in his demeanor, the confidence in his stride, and the warmth in his smile made it clear that he had arrived on his own terms. Some of the former classmates struggled to maintain composure. They looked at him, trying to remember the boy they had teased, but the image didn't match the man standing before them. There was no bitterness in his eyes, no anger to confront them. Instead, there was quiet strength, a sense of achievement, and the subtle message that their cruelty had never broken him. It was more powerful than any words of revenge could have been. He spoke to a few people who had been kind to him in the past, thanking them for the moments of support that had meant more than they could know. These conversations were brief but genuine, and they reminded everyone around that kindness, even in small amounts, could have lasting impacts. They also highlighted the contrast between those who had uplifted him and those who had mocked him, making his journey even more remarkable in the eyes of the onlookers. The whispers spread quickly. People who had gathered at the cafe, the park, and nearby shops all began talking about the man who had returned. They described his calm confidence, his presence, and the sense of respect he carried naturally. Some were amazed, others embarrassed, and a few were introspective, thinking about how they had treated him in the past. The transformation was undeniable, and it was happening right in front of their eyes. He didn't need to announce his success. It showed in the way he carried himself, in the quiet authority he radiated, and in the subtle details, the way he dressed, the calm in his voice, and the way he engaged with people. No one could ignore it. Even those who tried to dismiss him found themselves pausing, reevaluating the person they had once ridiculed. He had become someone who deserved attention, not because of wealth or status, but because of the resilience, effort, and strength that shone through naturally. A few of the former classmates tried to make light of the situation, joking about how he must have changed overnight, but their words lacked conviction. He had changed, yes, but it had been years of hard work, effort, and learning that had built the man they were now seeing. They couldn't take shortcuts to reach his level, and he knew it. The years of struggle, the odd jobs, and the nights spent learning and improving had given him something they could never steal or imitate. He smiled at one of the former classmates who had been especially cruel, a silent acknowledgement that he had forgiven the past, but also a subtle message that their words no longer had power. The boy they had mocked had become a man they could not intimidate or belittle. He had arrived with dignity, grace, and confidence, showing that success could be achieved quietly, without arrogance or bitterness. It was a lesson in strength that they could see but not replicate. Some people who had been quiet observers stepped forward, curious to talk to him. They asked about his work, his life, and the steps he had taken to achieve success. He answered politely, sharing stories of hard work, learning, and perseverance. People were impressed not just by the results, but by the humility and focus with which he spoke. He didn't need to boast. The achievements spoke for themselves. The quiet way he carried himself made the impact even stronger. As the day progressed, he walked through the gathering, acknowledging old faces, exchanging smiles, and sharing brief conversations. Every interaction reinforced the transformation. The town, once a place of embarrassment and ridicule, now felt like a stage where he could display the power of resilience and determination. People around him were learning an important lesson, that strength isn't always loud, and success doesn't require revenge or confrontation. He also noticed a few people who refused to acknowledge him, those who had been most cruel. He didn't let it affect him. He understood that not everyone would recognize growth or change, and that was okay. His purpose wasn't to win approval from them. It was to show that he had built a life on his own terms, a life of skill, confidence, and respect. Their refusal to recognize him only underscored how far he had come, how much he had grown beyond their judgments. By late afternoon, the energy had shifted completely. People were no longer whispering about the shy boy they had once seen. They were talking about the man who had returned, the life he had built, and the quiet power he carried. He had arrived in a way that didn't need drama or loud announcements. Presence, confidence, and the calm assurance of success were enough. Those who had mocked him were now facing the reality that the boy they underestimated had become someone remarkable. He took a moment to reflect. Years of struggle, odd jobs, late nights, and self-improvement had led to this moment. Every failure, every moment of doubt, and every whisper of ridicule had been turned into lessons, shaping him into a man who could face the world calmly and confidently. The town had changed little, but he had changed everything about himself. The transformation wasn't just visible, it was undeniable. Before leaving the gathering, he spoke quietly to a few people, sharing encouragement and advice about resilience, hard work, and self-belief. He wanted them to understand that the boy they had mocked had succeeded not because of luck, but because of persistence and determination. His words carried weight because they were backed by years of lived experience, struggle, and growth. People listened, inspired, and a few even reflected on how they had treated others in the past. As he walked away that evening, he felt a sense of satisfaction that went beyond revenge or recognition. He had shown quietly but powerfully that effort, patience, and focus could transform a life. The laughter, whispers, and mockery of the past no longer had power over him. He had arrived on his own terms, and the respect he now commanded was the result of his dedication, not anyone else's approval. He looked back at the gathering from a distance. People were still talking, still reacting, but the energy had changed completely. The boy they had laughed at was gone. In his place was a man who had built a life through effort, learning, and determination. He had turned every insult into motivation, every failure into a lesson, and every moment of isolation into preparation, and now they could see it clearly. That night, walking back to his hotel, he reflected on the journey. The transformation wasn't just about success or recognition, it was about proving to himself that he could rise above any challenge, any ridicule, and any moment of doubt. He had become the person he had always imagined, someone capable of facing the world with confidence and dignity. He knew the final chapter of his return wasn't over. There would be more interactions, more people to see, and more moments to navigate. But he felt ready. He had arrived, not as a boy seeking approval, but as a man who had earned respect through effort, resilience, and determination. And that quiet confidence, that calm presence was something no one could take away. The next morning, he woke up with a quiet sense of purpose. The previous day had been a moment of reflection and subtle confrontation, showing the town and the people who had once mocked him that he had changed. But he knew there was more to do. The final part of his return wasn't about proving anything to them. It was about completing his journey, letting his growth speak for itself, and leaving a lasting impression of the man he had become. He started the day early. Walking through the streets he had once wandered as a boy, everything seemed smaller now, familiar yet insignificant compared to the life he had built outside this town. The old school, the shops, the park, all of it held memories, some painful, some neutral. But this time he didn't see them as obstacles or reminders of humiliation. He saw them as markers of a journey, points along a path that had led him to where he stood today. The air was crisp, the morning quiet, and he felt a sense of calm focus. He wasn't in a rush. Each step was deliberate, each movement measured. He remembered how different things had been years ago, running past groups of kids laughing at him, feeling invisible, wishing he could disappear. Now he walked with confidence, aware of who he was and what he had accomplished. It wasn't arrogance. It was a quiet pride, a recognition that effort and patience could truly transform a life. As he passed the old basketball court, he noticed some of the same kids from his school days playing. They were older now, some married, some with children, some still working in familiar places. He remembered how he had once sat on the sidelines, too shy and too self-conscious to join in. Now he felt no envy, no longing. He only remembered the lessons he had learned: resilience, patience, and the importance of focusing on his own growth instead of trying to fit in. He decided to visit the old community center, a place where many gatherings had once taken place. He entered quietly, noting the familiar surroundings. People recognized him immediately. Whispers spread, and eyes followed him as he moved through the room. He greeted a few with polite smiles and firm handshakes. Some were genuinely surprised, their expressions a mix of disbelief and admiration. Others tried to hide their recognition, but there was no escaping the fact that the boy they had once mocked had become a man of presence and quiet authority. A small group of former classmates gathered together, whispering among themselves. He could hear fragments of their conversation. "Is that really him? I can't believe how much he's changed. Did he really do all that?" He didn't need to speak. His confidence, composure, and the calm way he carried himself told the story better than words ever could. He had arrived not to confront, but to demonstrate the transformation that years of effort, learning, and self-belief could create. He approached the group with a measured stride. The boy who had once led the teasing tried to joke, attempting to recreate the same dynamic from their school days. But the words faltered. There was no space for ridicule here. He smiled gently, acknowledging the person but making it clear that the old power dynamics no longer applied. The confidence he radiated, combined with the dignity in his tone, created a quiet barrier that couldn't be challenged by mocking words or old habits. People began to ask him questions, curious about his life, his career, and the steps he had taken to reach this point. He answered politely but honestly, sharing stories of odd jobs, long nights of learning, and the patience required to turn small opportunities into meaningful progress. Each story resonated with listeners, many of whom realized that the transformation was the result of consistent effort rather than luck or privilege. They began to understand that resilience, not mockery, was what had shaped him. One of the former classmates, the one who had been cruelest, stepped forward hesitantly. He looked at the man standing before him and seemed unsure how to proceed. There was no anger, no need for confrontation. He extended a hand and the man shook it firmly, eyes meeting eyes. That handshake carried years of lessons, growth, and quiet strength. It was a gesture that spoke volumes, acknowledging the past but showing that it no longer had power. Others in the room began to see a pattern. The boy they had ridiculed was no longer defined by their words. He was defined by his actions, his persistence, and the way he had built a life on his own terms. There was a sense of respect growing in the room, subtle but undeniable. People began to smile, nod in acknowledgement, and even apologize for old slights, realizing that they had underestimated him for years. He moved through the crowd, engaging with those who had once been kind and supportive as well. He thanked them quietly, showing that he had never forgotten their small acts of encouragement. These moments were brief but meaningful, reinforcing that kindness, even in small doses, could have a lasting impact. It also highlighted the contrast between those who had lifted him up and those who had tried to tear him down. By mid-afternoon, the energy in the community center had shifted completely. No one doubted his presence, his abilities, or the life he had built. People were talking, sharing stories, and reflecting on the journey they had witnessed unfold before them. The man they had once dismissed was now a figure of quiet authority, not through wealth or status, but through resilience, focus, and self-belief. He decided to step outside for a moment, breathing in the fresh air and observing the streets that had once been his daily challenge. He thought about the boy he had been, The moments of ridicule, the feelings of invisibility, and the nights spent dreaming of a better life. All of it had led to this moment, a moment of quiet triumph, where effort and patience had finally shown their power. As he walked back inside, he noticed a small group of younger people, teenagers who were curious about the newcomer in town. They asked him questions about his journey, how he had achieved success, and what motivated him to keep going despite difficulties. He spoke to them gently, encouraging them to focus on learning, persistence, and self-belief. He shared that setbacks and mockery were temporary, but determination and effort could build a foundation that lasted a lifetime. The impact on the young listeners was immediate. They nodded, listened intently, and asked more questions. He realized that his journey had a purpose beyond personal triumph. By sharing his story, he could inspire others to rise above their circumstances, to focus on growth rather than ridicule, and to believe in themselves even when the world seemed indifferent. By late afternoon, the community center was filled with conversations, laughter, and a sense of admiration. People were talking about his journey, the quiet strength he carried, and the transformation they had witnessed. Even those who had once mocked him were now silent, recognizing that the boy they had underestimated had become someone extraordinary. It was a moment of reflection for everyone, showing that effort, patience, and resilience could create change that was impossible to ignore. Before leaving, he took a moment to look around. The room was buzzing with conversation, but there was a sense of closure. He had faced the past, acknowledged it, and shown that growth was the result of persistence, not anger or revenge. He had transformed pain into strength, ridicule into motivation, and invisibility into presence. The journey that had begun years ago in isolation had come full circle. He stepped outside into the evening light, the streets quiet and calm. He felt a sense of peace knowing that he had completed this part of his journey. The town, once a place of pain and mockery, had witnessed the man he had become. But more importantly, he had proven to himself that he could achieve anything through effort, learning, and determination. He looked up at the sky, thinking about the years of struggle, the long nights, and the small victories that had built the foundation for his life. He realized that every step, every challenge, and every moment of doubt had been necessary. They had shaped him into someone capable of facing the world with confidence, dignity, and quiet authority. As he walked toward his car, he thought about the future. The town had seen the man he had become, but his journey was far from over. There were new challenges, opportunities, and paths to explore. Yet he felt ready for whatever came next. He had learned that true power came not from wealth, status, or revenge, but from resilience, effort, and the ability to remain calm and focused in the face of life's challenges. He started the car and drove slowly out of the town, leaving behind whispers, astonished glances, and a sense of admiration that would linger long after he had gone. He didn't need to return for recognition or applause. The transformation was his own, earned through years of dedication and patience. The boy who had once been mocked was now a man who had achieved a life defined by confidence, skill, and inner strength. As he drove into the horizon, he felt a quiet satisfaction. The journey had been long, filled with struggle, doubt, and hard work.